Hello everyone. Hi, I'm Ana Regina Campelo, and this is my name sign. I'm the vice coordinator of the Abralin's Libras work group, and I'm also a professor at the National Institute for the Deaf Education, INIS. And I also work in two graduate programs, one from INIS and one from Federal University of Niterói Fluminense. I'm very pleased to introduce Abralin series titled Abralin Live, Linguists Live, with the theme Exploring Networks of Lexical Variation in Russian Sign Language. And I'm introducing Professor Vadim Kimmelman. He is a professor of linguistics at the University of Bergen in Norway. He has researched and worked on a range of different topics in sign language linguistics, such as phonetics, morphology, syntax, semantics, and also pragmatics. His PhD thesis focused on information structure, analyzing two different sign languages. He also used computer vision tools to analyze these different markers. He has done some work on non-manual markers in different sign languages and also analyzed how these sign languages are structured and how these non-manual markers play a role in sign language grammar. Has also contributed to the creation of a lexical database for Russian Sign Language, which is the subject of his presentation today. This sign language database basically has Russian Sign Language and is available, and he's going to talk more about that in today's presentation. Vadim is going to speak in English, and we have interpretation, two different kinds of interpretation. First, Anderson Almeida Silva and Guilherme Lourenço will be interpreting from English to Libras, and the deaf community uh, extends their thanks for their partnership. We also want to thank the two other interpreters, Natasha Parkins and Lisa Zeviat, who are interpreting from English to International Sign. So thank you, interpreters, for your amazing work. Uh, Dr. Vadim, you will have approximately 45 minutes to give your presentation, and after that, participants will have the opportunity to ask questions via YouTube chat. They can ask questions in English or in Portuguese in the chat, and we will select those questions and give it to you after your presentation. Is that okay, Vadim? So have a nice talk. Thank you for having here.
Thank you very much, Professor Campello, for this introduction. And thanks to Abralin for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. So I hope I can tell you something interesting about Russian Sign Language. And specifically about variation, lexical variation in Russian Sign Language. So here is the plan for today's presentation. Please have a look yourself. Before I start presenting, I want to say that this is a result of joint work with many colleagues. And on this slide, you can see the faces of my colleagues who were the main collaborators in creating the database of lexical variation in Russian Sign Language, including my dear colleague Anna Komarova, who has unfortunately passed away. And many other colleagues, many more of the colleagues participated in this project. And if you want to know all of the names, you can go to the website of the database. So my presentation today is about lexical variation. And lexical variation is something that is attested in both spoken and sign languages. All natural languages vary. That is a very fundamental fact about natural languages. Sign languages are, of course, not different from spoken languages in this respect, and they show variation at all levels of linguistic structure. So one can observe phonological variation, where signs, for example, in different regions, are slightly different from each other on the phonological level. Lexical variation, where different variants of the same concept can be expressed by different lexemes. So on this slide, for example, you can see some photos of signs from British Sign Language, the signs for America, and you can see that the signs are completely different. So those are lexical variants. There is also grammatical variation. So clearly grammar is not exactly the same in, for example, different regions of the same country using the same sign language. Um, Similar to what has been done for spoken languages, we can ask the question, what causes the variation or what explains the variation in sign languages? So which factors are important for the choice of a specific variant of a lexeme or of a grammatical structure? And some factors are shared between the visual modality and the auditory modality. So in both signed and spoken languages, such factors as region, age, gender, ethnicity, and social class can all influence variation. So people in different regions can choose different signs. People of different ages, of course, can choose different signs, and so on. But some of the factors are specific to sign languages or more important to sign languages. One such factor is deaf or signing relatives, because as we know, not all deaf people grow up with deaf relatives and signing relatives. So not all deaf people grow up with sign language from birth. And that can also influence the way that they use sign language. Another very interesting factor that is relevant to sign languages is the school system. Because again, a lot of deaf people learn sign language or are exposed to sign language in the context of education, in the context of schooling. And therefore, in many countries, uh, the so-called dialects are actually centered around schools. So on this slide, for example, you can see a small picture of the Netherlands with the location of 5 schools for deaf children. Um, so um, in NGT, Sign Language of the Netherlands, the major dialects are in fact connected geographically to the locations of those schools. My research that I present today is focused on Russian Sign Language, so I will give you a little bit of background on Russian Sign Language. According to a national census from 2012, Russian Sign Language has at least 120,000 signers. It is a sign language that is at least 200 years old, because we know that the first school for deaf children was established more than 200 years old. Another thing that is important to know in the context of variation is that deaf education in Russia has been oralist for most of the 20th century. And then for a short period, there was some movement towards bilingual education or sign language education. But this movement is unfortunately being reduced at the moment. And another important factor to consider is that Soviet Union, during the times of the Soviet Union, education in general and deaf education in particular was highly centralized. And that means that the teachers of the deaf children and the interpreters, they were basically all trained in one of the very few places, typically in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And that means that some degree of standardization of Russian Sign Language was ongoing due to standardization in general in education. Before the current project that I'm presenting, the database of lexical variation in Russian Sign Language, some research had been conducted studying lexical differences between different regions. However, there was very little research and it was very fragmented. So some specific signs were compared across different regions and only across a small number of regions. Also, before we had this database, we had another resource that we used to do research on Russian Sign Language, and that is the online corpus of Russian Sign Language. However, that corpus is not at all representative of the regional diversity of Russian Sign Language because the video recordings were only done in 2 regions. So a couple years ago, we decided to create a database of lexical variation in Russian Sign Language. And we decided to collect the data fully online. So we built a website that anyone, any signer of Russian Sign Language could just open on their phone or on their computer, and they would be asked to record signs for a large number of concepts. Why did we do it this way? Well, first, this way we could access a lot of signers from all over the country without the need to travel everywhere ourselves. So logistically, it would be impossible. Another factor to consider is that all of this actually happened during the first year of COVID. So we were not allowed to go and talk to people too closely. Yeah, so the way that we approached people was that we spread information about this ongoing data collection via social media. And this way we could reach a lot of people, as I will tell you a bit later. But also this means that we cannot really get a representative sample of signers of Russian Sign Language. Obviously, the people who use internet most often were the ones who participated in this data collection, so younger people from larger cities also. In this website, when the signers opened the website, they were shown instructions in both Russian and Russian Sign Language. However, the stimuli, so what they were asked to use as stimulus for production of signs, were words in Russian. So they would see isolated words and they were asked to provide the corresponding sign of Russian Sign Language. They were also specifically asked to produce many variants if they know multiple variants. And we specifically focused on 4 different semantic fields: colors, kinship terms, school-related lexicon, and numbers. And we had our reasons to choose those fields. First, for colors, there has been a lot of studies of color terms in different sign languages. And we know that, for example, in British Sign Language, colors are very variable. So we thought we could compare potentially our findings from Russian Sign Language to other sign languages as well. For kinship terms, the story is also the same. There has been a lot of research on kinship terms in different sign languages and very interesting findings. The school-related lexicon was chosen because, as I explained a little bit before, schools have a very important place in emergence and spreading of sign languages. And so we thought maybe individual schools would also have individual signs that are related to school subjects. So we expected potentially a lot of variation there. And then finally, numbers we chose because anecdotally, so we have heard that number signs do not vary in Russian Sign Language. Everyone uses the same number signs. So we decided, okay, we want to test that. And of course, we also collected sociolinguistic information about the signers. So where they're from, where they studied, what school they went to, whether they had deaf signing parents or other relatives, whether they grew up with sign language or whether they learned it later in life. So I'm waiting because, okay, now I see Guillermo. Okay, I will continue now. The database that we collected is actually fully and openly available online, so anyone can check it and use it for research as well. The only limitation is that it is only available in Russian. However, I think Google Translate can help with that, and because it is a lexical database, uh, uh, it is not very difficult to figure out what sign is being shown, and then you can just see the different videos with the variants of the sign. So the database should be accessible even if you don't know Russian. And in this database, you can choose a concept that you're interested in and see all the videos produced by the participants for this concept. We have not published the annotations for the data, so the annotations for all the variants, because we haven't completed this annotation. In the very end of the talk, I'll have a slide about our publications on this project so far. So we have published some parts of annotations and some parts of the results, but the work is ongoing because we collected quite a lot of data, and it will require a lot of time to analyze all of it. I also have to say that there is currently no ongoing project with funding to work on this database. Okay, so what's in the database? As I told you, we collected signs for concepts from 4 different lexical fields, in total more than 100 concepts. And a lot of people participated, more than 300 people started participating, and more than 250 people recorded several signs. So it was not required of participants to record all the signs. They could stop at any point, but we would still get some useful data. In total, we have over 19,000 recordings, and one recording means a video produced by one signer for one concept, but that recording might contain multiple variants of a sign if the signer produces several variants. And so the number of variants is even larger in the database. And in terms of who participated in the data set, the age range is from 11 to 63, but the median age is 27 and a half. So as I explained, mostly young people participated, and a majority of them was women. We have a lot of participants from Moscow, which is the capital and largest city in Russia, and from St. Petersburg, which is the second largest city. However, the majority of participants are from other places, so we have different regions, different small and large cities represented in the dataset. And approximately half of the participants are from deaf families, so they have at least one deaf parent, and the other half do not. And that actually is very good for our purposes, because this means that we have enough data to explore whether the deaf parents as a factor influences the choice of variant in Russian Sign Language. So in the rest of the time, I will show you some cases of what we have done so far with this database, what we have learned from it, and what can be learned in future studies. And I realized that I'm going much slower than I thought I would. So I probably won't be able to cover everything that I have in my slides. But if you are interested afterwards to learn more about any of those topics, please let me know. Please contact me. I can share publications. I can also share unpublished research if you are interested. Okay, so let me start with the topic of lexical and phonological variation. So when we think of two variants of a sign for a concept, then fundamentally there are two simple scenarios. In one scenario, there are two signs for a concept which resemble each other very much and are just minimally different. So for example, the signs have the same hand shape, the same location, but slightly different movement. We would call that phonological variants of the same sign. However, the other scenario is that there are two signs for the same concept which are completely different, which have nothing to do with each other. So this situation we will call lexical variance. And the criterion to distinguish phonological variance from lexical variance, as stated in the literature and as used by many researchers, has been if two signs are different in one major phonological parameter, like hand shape, location, or movement, then they are phonological variant. If there are more differences than just in one phonological parameter, then that's lexical variance. Okay. So we try to apply the same criterion to our data in Russian Sign Language. So now I will show you two pairs of signs. The first is two signs for father, which are only different from each other in hand shape, so they are phonological variants. And then I will show you two signs for orange, as in color orange, and they share the hand shape, but apart from the hand shape, they are completely different. So they would be analyzed as lexical variants. Okay, so I actually mixed up things, and in the first pair of signs for father, the difference was not in the hand shape, but it was in the movement direction. But still, you could see that the signs are clearly very similar, except for the movement direction. And then in the second case, in the second video, the woman was also finger spelling in the beginning the word orange, the color orange, and then she showed the sign. However, we discovered that in fact, the criterion that we use to distinguish lexical and phonological variants simply doesn't work in cases where we have a network of variants which form different relations to each other. For example, they form a chain where two variants that are neighbors on this chain can be considered phonological variants of each other. And then also another variant can be considered a phonological variant of the second sign. But the first and the third sign no longer cannot be considered phonological variants because they are too different. So let me just illustrate this for you now. So the signs I showed you were for color light blue in Russian Sign Language. And as you could see, the first sign contained two types of movements. Sorry, the first sign contained the type of movement where the hand shape changes. Yes. And then the second sign contained this movement and also a circular movement of the hand. And the third sign contained the circular movement, but not hand shape change. So the first and the second sign are very closely related, and the second and the third sign are closely related. But the first and the third are not closely related enough to be considered phonological variants of each other. So what do we do in such cases? Well, in fact, that's just the top of the iceberg. The actual complexity of relations between different variants is much more complex. So there are a lot of different scenarios. So let me show you another scenario. So here is what we call the cycle scenario. And that is when several variants of the sign are interconnected. So in this case, the variants for the sign father can be um, connected to three other variants by phonological relations, but still some of the variants would be far enough from each other as not to be considered phonological variants. When I will show you the science, you will understand what the system looks like. You will see that there is variation in different parameters, namely in hand shape and in movement direction. And this variation is very systematic. But because the variation goes along two different parameters, some of the variants are just too far from each other. So the sign father can be produced with three different hand shapes, and each of the hand shapes can be combined with either downward or upward movement direction. And this forms this complex cycle of variants where some of the variants are clearly or by definition phonologically related, but others cannot be considered phonologically related because they are too distinct. And so far, I just showed you two problematic scenarios where we cannot, using the normal rule, decide whether signs are variants, phonological variants or lexical variants. But if we look at all the variants for some of the context, then complexity just grows and grows. So we use this kind of graphical representation where we plot each variant as a node or as a dot, and then we connect the variants to each other by lines if those variants can be phonologically related, and then we don't connect the variants that are not phonologically related. And now I will show you what it looks like in reality for some of the contexts. Yeah, so this is a representation of the concept reading as a school subject when you learn to read in primary school. And as you can see, the network of variants here is very complex. So we can see cycles there, we can see chains there, we can also see constellations that are completely separate from each other. So when some group of variants is clearly separate from others, then obviously those are different lexemes. But what do we do with the cases like in the leftmost part of this picture, where a lot of variants are related, but a lot of variants are also unrelated to each other? Here is another illustration, also a school subject, physics in this case. And here again, we can see some clear constellations. So some clearly separate variants, and also intertwined networks of variants that are related, some of which are related and some of which are unrelated. Okay, I'll go to the next slide. And another complication that we didn't even reflect in the previous graphical representations on the previous slide is that some of the variants are much more frequent than other variants. So in this representation of the concept child from Russian Sign Language, we again plot all the variants as circles, and they are connected if they are phonologically related to other variants. But now we also use the size of the circle to represent the frequency of this particular variant. And so that might be part of the solution of deciding what is a lexical variant, what is a phonological variant. Maybe lexical variants can be defined as sort of some neighborhood regions around more frequent variants. Anyway, a lot more explanation of these issues is required, and that is my main conclusion for this part. We have published a paper discussing this specific issue, the issue of deciding where the boundary between phonological and lexical variants lie. But the conclusion in this paper is the same conclusion that I just told you, namely that we don't have an answer. We discuss possible answers, but we do not have a definitive answer of how to understand this difference. Okay, so let me briefly talk about another aspect that could be explored with the help of this database of lexical variation, and that is influence from spoken language or contact with spoken and written Russian. From previous research on other sign languages, we know that, of course, sign languages often are in contact with the ambient spoken language, either in its oral or in its written form. And so this influence can be seen in many signs or on many different levels. In the form of mouthing, which is silent articulation of the word corresponding to the sign in meaning. Calques, which is translated structures from the spoken language. Finger spelling, which is letter by letter reproduction of a written word. Or initialization, which is the case when the handshape in the sign reflects typically the first letter of the word, of the corresponding word, and the letter comes from the finger spelling alphabet. And we can observe all or most of this phenomena of contact with Russian in the database as well. However, there are some caveats. So for example, if we consider mouthing, maybe the database is not a completely valid tool to study mouthing because the stimuli that we used were written words. So we could expect the signers to produce the mouthing of the specific word when they are producing the sign. Nevertheless, we can observe that mouthing is indeed almost always present. And we can also observe that mouthing can be used as a criterion for identifying compounds or complex signs, because we can see often that the mouthing spreads across both parts of complex signs. We can also observe finger spelling, which is present for many signs and especially for school subjects and for some non-basic color terms. Here we also face a methodological complication because it is not always clear whether the signer actually uses finger spelling as a lexeme for a particular concept or whether there is no lexeme and finger spelling is just used as a way to immediately borrow a word from Russian. Sometimes it is clear, as I will demonstrate you in the two videos here. So in the first video, in the end, the signer will produce what is clearly lexicalized finger spelling. And then in the second video, the signer will produce finger spelling, which clearly means that there is no sign. Okay. And I have accidentally switched off my my slides. I apologize. But I have reshared them now. Okay. Initialization is also very common in the data set. And this, I think, can be, so the database is quite a good tool to explore that. So we can see that in Russian Sign Language, at least in the domains that we explored, initialization is very widely present. For example, colors, all colors except for three, namely red, black, and brown, have at least one variant that is initialized. And for many colors, the initialized variant is also the most frequent one. School subjects as well almost universally have initialized variants also as parts of compounds. So I had to skip over one of the slides for the sake of time, because I want to talk about at least one more topic, and that is compounds. So compounds in sign languages are typically combinations of two or more signs that form a single lexeme, semantically and syntactically. And that means that, for example, their meaning can be non-compositional. Typically, compounds can also be identified by specific prosody or phonology. And as I said, mouthing usually spreads over the whole compound if it is present there. In sign languages, there are also a very interesting phenomena of simultaneous compounds, where the two hands are used simultaneously to produce two different signs. And that is something that is not available in spoken languages. But the majority of compounds in spoken languages as well are sequential compounds. So you have one sign and then you have another sign, and together they form a complex sign. But can we find something interesting, something unusual there as well? Well, we accidentally found something quite interesting in the data set. Because one important aspect about compounds in spoken and also in sign languages, as described before, is the fixed order of the parts. So, for example, in English, the compound blackbird the parts in the compound cannot be switched place. You cannot say bird black, right? And the same is true in sign languages, at least in some of them. But when we started exploring compounds in Russian Sign Language in our data set, this is not exactly what we found. Specifically, we found that indeed quite some signs in the dataset, quite some concepts are expressed by compounds, by complex signs. And some of those compounds have a completely fixed order of elements. Like, for example, the compound for husband consists of the signs marry, to marry, and then man. And you cannot switch the parts. You cannot start with the sign man. However, there is also several compounds where the order is not fixed but flexible. But even for those compounds, the flexibility is not complete, and there is a system behind it. So one very interesting case is the sign for parents in Russian Sign Language. And the concept parents in Russian Sign Language is expressed either by the combination of signs mother and father, or by a combination of three signs, mother, father, and relative. And interestingly, the order of the elements is almost completely free. So when you have two elements, you can say mother, father, or father, mother. And when you have the relative in this compound, you can also start with the sign relative or end with the sign relative. And also the order between mother and father is not fixed, as you can see on the slides. However, you still cannot do one thing. You cannot put the sign for relative between father and mother. So let me just show you the videos for some of the variants so that you believe me. Okay. So basically, at least in some of the compounds in Russian Sign Language, we can observe that they have a hierarchical structure, like in this case, but the order on each of the level of the binary morphological tree that we can propose here, the order of the elements within each level is not fixed. So does this mean that linear order is less important in sign languages? Because proposals like that have been made in the literature that because sign languages are so non-linear, they have so much simultaneity that maybe the order, the linear order, is less important. We don't actually think that we find any strong indication in this direction. Because first, even across sign languages, if we just look at some other sign languages, and if we look at similar compounds, so this type of compound is, for example, a symmetric compound, like father, mother, forming the concept parents. Even if we just look at some different sign languages, they have fixed order of elements. While in some other sign languages, the order is not fixed. So, for example, in Swedish Sign Language. So again, it would be very interesting to have a more wide-ranging typological exploration of compounds in sign languages and see what's going on with the order there. Is there indeed more flexibility than in spoken languages? Oh yeah, one important thing to mention is that there have been also some individual cases of compounds in spoken languages with non-fixed order. So we cannot say that we find something that is completely unique to sign languages here. And I think I'm basically out of time right now for the presentation, and so I will skip over the last part that I wanted to tell you, and that is our initial exploration of sociolinguistic factors influencing the choice of variant. And so I will only tell you one thing, and that thing is that we were not very successful in explaining the choice of the variant using any of the sociolinguistic variables. So quite often we have so many variants that none of the factors really explain how the variant is chosen. From our initial exploration, we did not find very clear dialects in terms of region. We do find some indications that different regions prefer different variants for some of the signs. And then for other signs, we don't find this pattern at all. In none of our initial exploratory studies did we find a difference between signers from deaf families and signers from hearing families. So it seems that both groups use the same variants of signs generally. Of course, it is possible that the very many sociolinguistic factors also interact with each other. And it is also possible that we should, even though it is extremely complicated theoretically, we maybe should distinguish between phonological and lexical variation and focus on explaining only the choice of lexical variants. So much more investigation into the sociolinguistic factors is required. A limitation here is the overall limitation of our database, namely that it is not representative. It was not built as a representative database. The participants were volunteers. So we have some groups that are extremely overrepresented and other groups that are extremely underrepresented. And this specifically, the underrepresented group is, for example, signers over the age of 60. We have almost no signers over the age of 60 in the database. So we hope that future projects can either help our database grow or that alternative databases will be created to explore the sociolinguistic factors in more detail. So to summarize my presentation, I hope that I managed to show you that lexical variation in sign languages can be very interesting. For example, we find very complicated, very intricate patterns of how different variants relate to each other in terms of form and how they form these complex networks of variants. We also find that variation in sign languages is overlapping or is being influenced by interaction with the spoken language that is used in the community. We can also find some phenomena in the lexical database that seem to be sign language specific, like the variable order in compounds. But much more research is required to make any strong generalization of typological sort. Yeah, so I hope just that you got a little bit interested in our database and what we find there. And so please have a look at the database. It is fully openly accessible, as I said. If you want to use any of the annotations that we did for the variants of different signs, you can ask and we will give you access.
Congratulations, Vadim. Thank you for your amazing talk. Uh, we have some questions in the chat. I don't know if we can show the question on screen. We have a question from a person on YouTube. And I also have a question for you. So this question is on linguistic and language variation. This is a very, very interesting topic. And we know that many variables can influence this type of variation. We have school, we have family, we have language background, and also if the deaf kid has an interpreter or not. So there are many different variables that sometimes are hard to be separated from each other. And how can we decide if this is a phonological variation or a lexical variation? This was a very nice presentation on that. But I was thinking about the deaf background in terms of schooling, because inside of these different schools, we don't have many deaf teachers. So at least here in Brazil, this is our situation. Most of the teachers in schools are hearing teachers, and somehow some of these hearing teachers have different backgrounds learning sign language. So sometimes we have interpreters that used to be interpreters and then start to teach in schools. And we have some hearing teachers that are not that fluent in sign language because it's their second language. They are not native signers and they are not actually part of the deaf community. So I keep thinking that this might also influence and have some impact on phonological or lexical variation. At least this is the situation here in Brazil. And I've seen that many, many times that the sign language that these teachers use in classrooms are not that uh, perfect or that fluent or that native like. So I was thinking about this when you were presenting on phonological variation and on lexical variation. Uh, and you have some uh, sociolinguistic data in your questionnaire, but did you ask these deaf participants who were their teachers, if they had hearing teachers or deaf teachers in school? And obviously, we think that it might have an impact. You presented about there's no significant difference between deaf families and hearing families. Okay, but maybe who was your teacher in school, this could have an impact on the linguistic variation, if this is phonological or lexical. Could you talk a little bit more about that, if you can, like disentangle schooling background and other kind of influences in sign language variation? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for the great comment and question. I agree with you that it would be very interesting and important to explore in more detail what the real situation of acquisition of sign language is for the different participants in terms of school as well. So to answer your question immediately, we do not have this information. So we did not ask them about how exactly they learned sign language or who their teachers were specifically in schools. Uh, because you're absolutely right. Um, if so, if on the one hand, if school is very important, then we would maybe expect a difference then between um, participants with deaf parents and participants without deaf parents, because for the participants without deaf parents, the source of sign language for them is the school. And then if the school is so important, if the teachers, for example, if the teachers are hearing, maybe they have less variants, maybe they use the more standard variants, and then the signers would also acquire fewer variants, maybe. So that could have happened. We don't observe it in our data. But of course, the real situation of acquisition is so complicated. It's the teachers, right? But it's also the other children in school who might have deaf parents. And so what variants are actually acquired and what variants designers then remember and show us where they come from, like this information is not really available to us. But I can tell you one thing that we could still do, that we thought about doing but haven't done. And that is for Moscow specifically. So Moscow is the capital of Russia and a huge city, and it has several deaf schools. One of the deaf schools, at least, used to be a bilingual deaf school with a lot of deaf teachers, with a majority of deaf teachers, actually. While others were more oralist. And so what we can do, at least, is we can take the subset of signers from Moscow and try to look carefully which school they attended and whether this can explain the variation there. So we thought about it, but unfortunately, until now, no one has managed to find the time and focus on this research question.
Thank you, Vadim. We have some questions in the chat. Let me see if I can put it on screen. Uh, okay, first question. Thank you.
Yeah. Um,
Can we switch the interpreters? Are we switching interpreters now? I'm not so sure.
So, right, she doesn't want to sign but I will ask Anderson to read in order to the IS interpreters to do the translation. So, do you think that instead of only considering the number of changing parameters, we should also observe the etymological root of the sign?
yes. I didn't talk about it, but of course, this is absolutely correct. So there is an additional criterion when we are thinking about two variants and considering whether they could be phonological or whether they have to be lexical. We are also looking at etymology, or more precisely, we don't know the etymology, but we are looking at the iconicity, right? So if we see, for example, that one sign for, okay, let me think of a real example. Um, Okay, I cannot, from the top of my head, come up with a real example, but from our database. But imagine that we have one sign for color orange that depicts the fruit orange, right? The fruit. And then we have another sign that depicts, I don't know, the sun, which is also orange. Then, even if those two signs would be phonologically similar, we would not consider them to be phonological variants because clearly they relate to different notions. They are based on different iconic mechanisms. They depict different objects, right? However, this criterion is not always useful because first, in many cases, we do not know the etymology of the sign and the iconicity is unclear or non-existent. So here, let me give you an example. So color terms, very often they are not iconic, often they are initialized. So I can show you some variants of the sign blue in Russian Sign Language, which are initialized. So in Russian, the word for blue is sini, so it starts with the letter S. So let me show you some signs. So all of those signs are similar to each other. All of them represent the letter S in some form. So all of them can be considered initialized. None of them is really iconic. So iconicity doesn't help us here. Etymology doesn't help us here because we don't know where the signs come from, apart from the fact that they are due to contact with spoken Russian, so they are initialized. So the answer is yes, we are aware we are using etymology or iconicity as one of the criteria, but unfortunately that doesn't resolve the problems.
So we have other question here. So from Laisi, when you have a flexible ordered compound, mouthing can spread over all the combinations or just some of them. Were prosodic breaks taken into account when analyzing the flexible compounds?
Yeah, this is also a great question. And the answer is yes. Indeed, first, prosody in general was definitely used in order to determine whether a sequence of signs was a compound. So if we observed a sequence with a break or with a change in non-manual activity. Well, typically it's just a pause, right? So some kind of pause or a hold. If we observe that, we don't consider it a compound. We consider it a separate variant. And in most cases, the sequences were very unambiguously prosodically together. And one aspect of prosody that we also took into account is mouthing, which indeed can spread over parts of the compounds in different orders. I cannot now sort of guarantee you that we have a clear example of mouthing spreading for each of the possible combinations, because the overall frequency that of the different combinations is not that high. But the behavior, the overall behavior for all types of orders is that, yeah, mouthing spreads across the whole compound.
Right. Thank you. We have another question. Thank you for the presentation. I've been working on a Libris dictionary, and one of our great challenges is to determine if a certain sequence of signs is a compound sign or a complex lexia. So I don't know if it has more, like a complement. So my question is, how do you determine a sequence of signs is a compound sign?
So I think I partially answered this question already. So we used prosody as the main criterion. So if the sequence produced had one single prosodic contour, so there were no pauses, there were no changes in non-manuals, then we considered it as a possible compound. Sometimes there were additional clues. For example, let me show you. Well, one of the examples that I showed you was the compound for parents, which consisted of three parts. And the parts were mother, father, and relative. But importantly, some of the signers actually produced several variants. So, for example, they would produce mother, father separately. Then they would produce the sign relative separately, which can also mean parents, just the sign relative in isolation. And then as the third variant, they would produce mother, father, relative together. So then we can clearly see that this is indeed a compound because the sign relative in isolation was already produced as a variant. So when it occurs again, it occurs as part of a compound. That is our logical conclusion.
So another question is, considering the big amount of data, only matchings can analyze sign similarities and give us clues about where to go.
Yes, so we have been thinking about that as well. I even had one line on the slides that I didn't say, but indeed it is possible to approach the data in a different way, sort of in a bottom-up way. So what we could potentially do is, instead of trying to figure out which variants are related to each other, which variants should be separate into separate lexemes and which shouldn't, what we could do potentially is just carefully describe each variant that we find in terms of phonological parameters. So for example, using a system of notation like Hamnosis, so Hamburg notation system. So if we use Hamnosis to describe each variant, then we can then use computer and ask the computer to build to classify, to cluster the data, to find clusters in the data, to say, okay, these signers seem very similar to each other based on the variants that they use. And we can also cluster variants. So we can say, okay, these variants are very similar to each other based on the phonological parameters in them. So we can indeed use various algorithms to try and uncover the underlying structure there. However, this indeed requires, as the first step, careful phonological or phonetic annotation of the data. And so far, we didn't have the resources to undertake this huge annotation project. Because as I told you, we have 19,000 videos and each video contains typically more than one variant.
How can your how can your study contribute to the phylogenetic relations among sign language families in the world?
This is also an excellent question. And this is something we thought about, right? Because you probably have seen some recent studies. So there have been studies 10, 20 years ago on relations between different sign languages in the world and on trying to establish families of sign languages based on lexical comparison. And recently, some quantitative studies have been done where people have indeed carefully annotated, phonologically annotated signs in many sign languages, and then they used computational phylogenetic techniques to sort of automatically build the family relations or discover the family relations. However, all of those studies basically presuppose that there is only one variant or maybe a couple variants for a certain sign in each sign language. Because the data that they are using are dictionaries. And in typical dictionaries and typical published dictionaries, what you have is usually one variant, or maybe you have two, maybe you have three, maybe you have four variants of a sign. But what we see in our database in Russian Sign Language is that some signs have 20 variants, some signs have 25 variants, right? So the real variation, the real possibilities within one sign language are much greater than we thought. And so, in principle, ideally, we should use these variation databases. We should create variation databases for all sign languages and only then apply the phylogenetic methods to this data, because then we will potentially see much more overlap. Or maybe we won't see more overlap, but we will see different patterns. Because, yeah, in order, I think, to discover the sort of the real phylogenetic relations between different sign languages, we need to start with this variation within the sign language. Yeah, so that is my answer. But again, this is some work that is only possible in future. And here, I think we need comparable large databases of variation for many more sign languages.
Right. So considering that we have no more questions on the chat, um, I think we are on time, right? By now, we have like 1 hour and 18 minutes. So we have plenty of time. So we are going to the end of our talk. So Abralin, ao vivo, the coordination of the sign language work group, we are thinking on that on the future, we need to do something like to have more research groups considering the data from Libras, right? So to investigate phonological, morphological aspects involving not only the semantic but also the pragmatics approach to it. And we need to create a more number of like a network, as you said, to cooperate, because we have some databases created here in Brazil. We actually do some databases here. So the examples of Universidade Federal Santa Catarina, it has a corpus of Libras, and it has been used by undergrads that they can find information about sign language there. But I see that in the case that you show with like for Russian and Netherlands, of course, dictionaries are not enough, and we actually need more live information about that comes from our deaf consultants. It was very interesting, very smart of you of using the webcam. So I hope that in Brazil we can create some similar research to develop new comparisons in the future. I don't know, and create a project trying to find these etymological roots of Brazilian sign language that maybe is lost. So like I want to know from where my sign came, but uh, like what we know by the general sense is that it came from French Sign Language, but of course we have no records by this time. So Vadim, I just want to thank you a lot for your presentation. It gave us a lot of reflections. Uh, so I just right. Thank you, the people from the web chat. I don't know if anyone wants to say your final words, Vadim.
Yeah, thanks again for inviting me. It was very exciting to present it, and I think we had great questions. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So thank you, the interpreters from Brazil, and thank you, the international sign interpreters as well, for providing accessibility. Bye bye. May we take a picture then? Yeah, of us together. Bye bye.